Once upon a time, not that long ago, my friends at Houghton Horns wanted me to make a sort of introduction to rotary trumpet video for them, and they sent me a B-flat and a C Rikokun rotary trumpet, and they wanted me to play the rotaries a little bit and just to share some information about how they work, why we would use rotary trumpets, so that their audience could get some of that information. Unfortunately for me, I don't really know that much about rotary trumpets. We don't play them in the ASO, and in the past, I haven't really understood why. I just was told this is what you do on Beethoven and Brahms, and sometimes Wagner and Bruckner and stuff like that. I knew I needed to get some help for this particular project, so I reached out to my friend Micah Wilkinson, the principal trumpet with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, and he and I Zoomed and talked for a while, just with him giving me some information about rotaries and really helping me to understand the why behind why we use them. Originally, I was just going to excerpt some of that conversation and use what was relevant for the Houghton Horns video, but I thought the whole conversation was so great that I actually just edited it together, and I'm going to leave the whole entire conversation here in this video for you to check out. If you're interested in seeing the video I made for Houghton Horns, I'll leave a link in the description. You can click on that, but make sure you watch this one first, and then you can check that one out.
When you're testing out rotaries or you're looking for ones that are a good fit for you, what kinds of qualities are you looking for? What tells you that this is one that you like versus one that you don't like as much? And then also, what kinds of music do you usually use to test it out? Is it exercises or do you use repertoire? Kind of what's your process with all of that?
Well, I think it's important that when we're testing any instrument, that we have a strong concept of the sound that we want in the first place. And so German rotary trumpet is a great tool in the United States for when we play the music of Brahms and Beethoven and Schumann and Wagner in the United States, and it's becoming a very commonly used tool for that. And so a strong concept of what we want to sound like comes from listening to recordings from German and Austrian orchestras and really getting a sense for how those instruments integrate within the orchestra and what they can sound like, what the color spectrum is on those instruments, so that we aren't coming to the horn with a concept of a piston trumpet, but that we have some idea of what a rotary trumpet can sound like, ideally from live performances and recordings, or a teacher who can demonstrate. When I'm testing a rotary trumpet, or any trumpet, I'm looking for a compelling sound, something that feels like my voice on the instrument, and something that has an array of colors, and colors in tone quality and in articulation, and so that I can have a variety of expressive tools available to me on the instrument. I don't want something that's just stiff and uniform and does one thing really well, but doesn't give me options for expression. And on a rotary trumpet, I'm going to test that with usually music, because I want to be thinking artistically and thinking musically when I'm testing something. I want to put myself in a sort of a performance state of mind, not a testing state of mind, when I'm trying an instrument. So I'll play licks, passages from the repertoire, and on a rotary trumpet, that might be the Beethoven Leonorcals. It might be something basic from a Beethoven symphony that's arpeggiated and articulated, to just see how that response is and how the sound blooms, and if it speaks in the way that I'm looking for, and if it has dynamic shades of loud to soft, and then I'll test more chromatic passages from Wagner or Bruckner, just a couple little memorized licks, something lyrical, and then I want to kind of test the extremes. I want to see what it's like when I really go for hot and brighter louds, and what the sound does when I want it to be covered and soft.
So I'm assuming to some degree that not only do you want the sound concept that you hear in your head to be present, but with some degree of ease as well, right? How far down the it is easy do you go before it's like, well, this is, I can do what I want, but it's too hard. I should keep looking for something else.
That's an important question. And we are seeking a balance between this compelling sound and something that we can actually play, and something that I would say is compatible. So compelling and compatible are sort of the two words that I would hold, at once when I'm trying an instrument, because I want to be able to have something really special in the sound and in the speech, but then also something that integrates within my home environment. So where you play matters. If you're looking for an instrument to play in a professional orchestra, then the hall in which you play is part of the instrument. And so testing the instrument in that hall is essential. Testing the instrument during rehearsal, during performances, is something that I always do. So if there's an instrument that appeals to me, I think I might like this, I'm going to try it this week in the Pittsburgh Symphony. I'm going to bring it into the first rehearsal. And maybe after the first half of the first rehearsal, I think, oh no, that's not going to work. I'll know immediately. Or, there's something really special about this. I think I like this. I'm going to stick with it. And I do the same thing with a mouthpiece or other subtle changes. I've got to give it a chance in a performance environment to truly know. My basement here is great, but it's totally different than the hall. And so something that I like down here might not work at all in the hall. I am looking, you asked about ease and playability. And so I think it's important to find an instrument that's compatible with your home environment. And it's important to find an instrument that's compatible with your natural way of playing and your skill set. And so I think on any instrument, you're looking for a feeling of balance where you can step into that artistry mode where you're not thinking of how to produce anything. You're just singing through the horn. And you can do that by finding a balance point where everything kind of sits in a comfortable place on the horn, and you don't have some notes going that way and some notes going that way. You don't have things, flying back at your face or just blowing and not feeling any feedback. And so I think a great instrument has a balance between the feeling of blow and feedback. It can take a little bit of time when you're adjusting to a rotary trumpet, because if you look at one, there's an obvious difference, which is that the valves are, rotors, but also you've got a short lead pipe going straight into the valve section instead of on a piston trumpet where you have a long lead pipe connected to the tuning slide that goes into the third valve. Right, so the air goes straight into the valve section on a rotary trumpet. And then on a rotary, out of the valve section, you have this long section of tuning slide and then a very long bell with a big wide flare and a bigger bell. So this C rotary trumpet bell is much bigger than my piston C bell. And, the flare's quite different. My B flat right over here is an even bigger bell. So that's going to feel different. And it's, of course, going to sound different. And I think on a rotary trumpet, the problem is in America, we're used to the piston trumpet, and we think, okay, I got to play a rotary trumpet. And we try to play it the same way, and we expect a sound that's going to be the same or very similar to the piston trumpet.
This is where I'm at right now.
Yeah.
I've been playing these Rico Coons, and I play it, and I'm like, well, based on what I normally feel, I like this. But I had gone back and listened to something I recorded, and I was like, that doesn't sound anything like what I thought it sounded like on the other side of the bell, right? Like when I was listening to it, I was thinking, okay, cool. This sounds about like what I'm used to, but then yeah, listening to what it actually sounded like, I was like, oh my gosh, this doesn't sound anything like it. So I'll let you continue, but I feel like I'm really in that sort of, this is kind of why I'm glad we're having this conversation, to hear that this is a normal thing, that you're gonna have this back and forth a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. It's a totally different approach and sound, I think. And so you have to accept that and look for something different. And that's why it's important to, I think, listen and have an opinion about like which players, in Germany and Austria do you prefer? Which orchestras do the trumpet section have a sound that really grabs you, and from what era? If you can sort of like dial that in, then you can say, I'm looking for that sound, not just I'm playing a rotary trumpet because it's Brahms and I'm going to listen to such and such American orchestra recording, and try to imitate that. I would start, with a European sound and explore the different possibilities. And the cool thing about the rotary trumpets is that it's so regional over there. There's so many different makers. They're all incredibly skilled craftsmen, and they've had their craft passed down through generations in their families. And each region has its own approach to instrument building and also to playing. And so you'll have an orchestra in East Germany, in Dresden, that sounds different than an orchestra in Bavaria, in Munich, that sounds different than the Berlin Philharmonic, that sounds different, than obviously the Austrian orchestras in Vienna. And each one of those places had, master teachers who had played in the orchestra or who still play in the orchestra, who then have students who go to school there, and they have instrument builders near that town where they play those instruments and they learn to play those instruments. And so you have much more regional taste, which is wonderful, but it creates this incredible, array of options out there that can be confusing for an American consumer, when in America, there's like a piston trumpet sound, right?
Right.
And everyone's looking for that classic American piston trumpet sound. And in Germany and Austria, that's not the case. So you have options.
Yeah.
You have, in Vienna, they play in the Musikverein. And have you ever been there?
Nope.
So I played there on tour with the Pittsburgh Symphony, and I met up with one of the people in the Vienna Symphony who also play in that hall. And before our rehearsal, he said, hey, if you want to try any of our trumpets, they're in that crate right over there. You can take them out on stage. So, really? Okay. So I walked out on stage with my rotary trumpet, which at the time was this Schagel Horsdorf Heavy, and brought out one of theirs, which was a lighter instrument. And I realized immediately in that hall that the density that my heavier instrument provided was not necessary and counterproductive in that hall. In that hall, I needed this transparency and brilliance and a different sort of color palette.
Yeah.
And see why they played those instruments there in that hall, and why on the recordings with the Vienna Philharmonic, they sound the way they do. But 2 days earlier, I played that instrument in Berlin in the Philharmonic Hall there. I thought it worked really well. And it was designed more for a space like that, I think.
I'd love for you to speak to the differences of mouthpieces as well, because this is another thing I don't really know much about at all, is why is it different for me to play my own mouthpiece that I'm used to on my piston versus a mouthpiece that may be more fit or suited? The only one I really know of is the Breselmeyer mouthpieces. Those are the ones that I've played, and they seem to make a difference in the ease and the sound and stuff like that. But I've also heard some other people just play their own mouthpieces and it kind of works. So if you might speak to that a little bit, the mouthpiece distinction, and how we would understand, is it possible to play our own that we're used to, or do we really have to, for the full effect, search for a different mouthpiece maker completely?
Right. Well, I think that one important difference with the mouthpieces is the outside taper of the shank is different on a German mouthpiece. Like on your Breselmeyer that you mentioned, it's going to go in differently than on your piston mouthpiece, which has a different taper. And so that puts the mouthpiece in a different spot when it goes in. I think that experimenting with a German-Austrian mouthpiece is important because it can impact the intonation, it impacts the response, which you want it to be a little softer response. And on an American trumpet, so an American trumpet has a more focused, compact, together sound, right? And it penetrates. It's focused. It's direct. And a rotary trumpet sound is rounder in the sense that it's sort of open-ended, and it's a little bit harder to hear the sort of focused middle on a rotary trumpet. And the articulation is different. On a piston trumpet, you've got very clear fronts, and on a rotary trumpet, there's a little bit more bloom in the way that the sound is produced. And that can be enhanced, I think, by a mouthpiece like a Breselmeier that allows naturally that kind of response, which you want when you're playing, especially certain repertoire. And if you play your American mouthpiece, it's going to focus up the sound and give you this sort of direct articulation, which maybe you're used to. But if you're playing Brahms, you're going to try to round it out and soften it. And you're going to end up playing, I think, in almost like a hesitating way. And you don't want that. You want to be able to deliver into the instrument. And so the two mouthpiece makers that I've found that really work on the rotary trumpets are the Breselmeier and JK exclusive models. And it is instrument dependent. So on the Austrian and Bavarian instruments that I've played, Lechner, Dovids, Chagrel, the Breselmeier was definitely the mouthpiece for me. On some of the more northern German or East German makers, like Rico Kuhn, the Breselmeier didn't work as well. And so Enrico actually recommended to me to try my Bach mouthpiece. And I thought, what? And their lead pipe is different, I guess. And so not all of my Bach mouthpieces worked, but I did find one that I thought, oh, this works pretty well. And so I used it on a week of Dvorak 9 to see how it would go. And it went great. But then since then, I've also found a JK that I think works even better. Again, this goes back to expecting a difference in the sound and in the feel. And if you're looking for a different sound, then you're going to be inclined to look maybe for a different mouthpiece that would help you achieve that different sound, rather than just sticking to something that's completely familiar and knowing that it's just going to look different and you'll get the doubling.
When I'm thinking about a rotary, I'm thinking about it specifically for an audition, right? Like that's the only reason I need a rotary for any given thing. And so it is this like weird specialty thing where I'm not thinking about it as how can I bring this into my job and what does this sound like? I don't know what the hall I'm going to play in is going to feel like. And I remember I took that Chicago audition, the Esteban one, and I was doing pretty well in the round that I was playing until I got to Schumann 2, where I had to play the rotary, and I had just purchased this rotary and I was using a Breselmeier mouthpiece. So it was like the right combination, but I didn't have it that long. And I just hadn't figured out how to blow through it. Basically, it's like different than what I was used to. And I wasn't necessarily expecting a different sound. What you're talking about really resonates with me, that I was sort of expecting to play soft and get the same feedback that I'm used to from my piston trumpet. And so it ended up just sounding kind of tentative. And like you said, almost like hesitating instead of really filling the space.
Picking out a rotary trumpet as a student or as an auditioner or maybe you don't have a performance venue where you're going to plug it in and you know what kind you need for that, but you're looking for something that's just going to help you on the audition trail, and that isn't an important tool. Here in the United States, get a C rotary trumpet first. If you're going to go to Europe, you're going to need a B flat rotary and a C rotary, but you're going to start with a B flat rotary because you're going to be playing the Haydn concerto in your first round on a B flat rotary. My first rotary that I purchased was a Rico Kuhn B flat after studying in Germany, and I ended up staying in the United States and auditioning here and realizing pretty quickly, you know what, I actually need a C more than I need this B flat. And so I sold the B flat. Spending time on the instrument with your fundamentals, with your etudes, with your solo repertoire, some of the same repertoire that you have always played on your piston, play it on your rotary instead. The rotary is also a smaller bore instrument, and that's another thing that can feel different. You can't blow this instrument the same way that you blow the piston trumpet. It takes a little bit more sort of nuance and coaxing. You know, it's like you find that balance and then you can sing. That's an important, I think, transition, and I think it can be accomplished by just picking up the rotary. If you want to learn an instrument, then play it at least half the time at home. Play the rotary for, you know, your whole routine for a month. And you'll start to notice some of the intonation tendencies, which may be the opposite of what your intonation tendencies are in certain partials from your piston trumpet. You'll start to recognize, oh, you know, I don't have to play to what feels like that dynamic level, you know, in terms of the blow and the feel to hit forte. I can actually play here and just allow the color to change. And so if you're okay with that, you have to sort of be willing to accept that there's more color change, then you can be comfortable with the instrument more quickly. You know, it's a overgeneralization, but you could basically say that you have sort of an Austrian or Southern Germany style of instrument building, which a Breselmeyer mouthpiece is very well suited for, which is a lighter instrument usually, and very clear and transparent. You know, famous makers are Lechner and Schagel. Those are probably the most well-known, and Dovids from Munich is another great one. And then as you go to other, you know, more northern, then you get instruments that are a little heavier and that have a little bit more density to the sound. And those are ones where perhaps a different mouthpiece is useful, like a JK, or maybe even a standard mouthpiece. And some of those makers would be Rico Kuhn, Monke, Weimann. Those are some of the sort of classic and modern makers. Many more, but those are just a few. So that sound is something I think that has to my ear, a little bit of a broader color spectrum and a more omnipresent sound, a little bit less focus. So I would say that, you know, in my experience, the Schagel instruments play a little bit more like a piston and sound a little bit more like a piston. And a big factor in that is the maker of the valves. And Schagel has started making their own valves, but the valve section on a Rico Kuhn is different. So it has a different blow. It has a different sound. It's incredible, really, the difference in the feel. And so on the valve section on a Rico Kuhn, I get a little bit more resistance, which I actually prefer. It's a more comfortable feeling for me. And on a Zierenbauer valve section, it's going to be a little bit more of an open blow to the horn, which feels maybe a little bit more like a piston trumpet. Because remember, you have that short lead pipe, and so if you feel like you're sort of able to blow more into the instrument, then it might feel more familiar. And so that could be an easier transition. But for me at this point, the feeling on this valve section is really the most comfortable.